So moving right along here, we're going to look at Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who, like Tennyson, was an early Victorian poet. And I'm really excited about these next two parts, the last two parts of our lecture, because Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning were a couple. They were married, and their story is a very sweet one, and they really wrote some brilliant poems. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning, I just love her poetry. And she stands out because she was this successful female poet during a time when um, female poets or females in general didn't have very many rights. And she achieved her fame before she met her husband, independent of her husband. She was actually more famous than him during her lifetime, and she really wrote some beautiful, very influential. Um, so, as I mentioned, she was very famous during her lifetime, but she fell out of the canon for a little while. In other words, she was really popular during the Victorian period. But then in the 20th century, there was a strong reaction against Victorian writing. Just as the Victorians reacted against the Romantics reacted against the Enlightenment thinkers. And so T.S. Eliot and others critiqued the Victorian period, and during that time, people read her less. But the last 30 years or so, there's been, rightly so, renewed interest, in part because she was a successful female poet and she really engaged with the social issues of the day. She really looked at situations where people did not have the rights they should, and situations where people were being abused, and used her poetry to stand up for them. And so, for those reasons, people have started studying her again. And like I said, rightfully so, because she has some brilliant and interesting poems. Again, kind of that idea of home education I mentioned in the Tennyson lecture. She was educated by her brother's tutor. Her family had a big library, so she read voraciously, and she actually published her first volume of poetry at age 13. And again, like I mentioned, was a successful poet before she met Robert Browning. But unfortunately, as she got older, she struggled with health issues, and she had a very controlling father. He had 11 children. He would let none of them marry. Um, but we'll see what happens there. Robert Browning, who we'll study next, became interested in her because of her poetry. So, as I mentioned, she was successful independent of him, and before she met him, and reading her poetry is actually what interested him in her. Her father did allow her to have visitors, and she was a famous poet, so people would come to visit her for those reasons, and he was one of them. But he came with the idea of courting her and marrying her. He basically fell in love with her before he met her through reading her poetry. And so the two eloped in 1846. So her father, very controlling, would not let her marry. And so, yeah, they had to elope. They went to Italy and lived there. Um, they had a great life there. Browning really helped her with her health issues. She became much healthier, so much so she was able to give birth to her son, Penn, and she also became interested in Italian nationalist politics. Those are some of the causes for which she wrote poetry to support. And they had 15 happy years together. She was already older, and so was he when they met. She was 6 years older than him, and so she died in 1861. But they did have 15 years together, and she got to see her son, reach the age of being a teenager. And so those are quite some achievements considering her background and that they had to escape the clutches of her father. My last point before we look at some of the poems is that one of her really significant contributions is a book length poem called Aurora Leigh. And so as I mentioned, the Victorians just love narrative, and even the poets like to write long narrative poetry. And so Aurora Leigh is basically like a novel in verse form. But it's really interesting because it tells the story of a female poet who's learning her craft, learning how to write, negotiating being a female poet in a very patriarchal time. And so our textbook has some selections from it, but it's really a shame if you can't read the whole thing, and there are so many other great poems by her, I didn't assign them. But if you ever have time or you take a 400 level class from me, it would be great to read Aurora Leigh. All right. So just like with Tennyson, I've included a historical context section, one of those Victorian issues sections. And this one is called Industrialism, Progress or Decline. And so the Industrial Revolution is it's it's this monster of a historical factor. So we really don't have time to cover it in detail. And we're really just looking here at the issue of child labor that was so important to Elizabeth Barrett Browning into what is perhaps her most famous poem, which we'll look at in a minute, Cry of the Children. Um, but the Industrial Revolution was such a hugely influential factor in the Victorian period that I'd encourage you to read some of these other readings from this section and study it more. Perhaps even consider writing on it for your paper. There's a lot you can do with it. Um, so it wasn't just one factor that led to the Industrial Revolution. It was a combination of a number of things, but some of the primary ones were technological innovations. People just invented new things. Population growth. Um, there are more people being born, so these technological innovations had to be used to help accommodate their needs. Increase in agricultural efficiency. You had new inventions like the threshing machine that made some of the farm laborers obsolete because their work could be done by a machine. Um, Greater mobility of capital, and finally, transformation of the product of textiles. So, textiles is one of the main products of the Industrial Revolution. In towns like Manchester, were entirely devoted to the production of textiles. A couple novels that address these industrial changes are Dickens's Hard Times and Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. Both are great. I recommend reading them. Hard Times is actually a short novel for Dickens, so it's fairly easy to get through. And North and South is just a great, enjoyable novel. There's a really good mini-series version of it too you can watch. Not everyone was a fan of the Industrial Revolution. It was a complicated time. Um, Writers such as Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin really were not fans of the Industrial Revolution and lamented the loss of past ways of life, particularly medieval feudalism. They saw capitalism, the rise of capitalism, being associated with the Industrial Revolution and missed feudalism, which is a system from the medieval times where you have um, uh, a landowner renting out his land to a tenant farmer, and then the tenant farmer hiring laborers to work the land. And so you have a hierarchical set of relationships, but nonetheless one where these people are devoted to each other. They've entered into an agreement with each other. So there's a human connection that was part of feudalism. And Carlyle and Ruskin and others like them saw industrial revolution and the capitalism that went along with it destroying the connected part, the human part of business and making business a detached, um, dehumanized thing. Um, Another important part of this is Frederick Engels, who co-wrote the Communist Manifesto with Karl Marx, actually observed working conditions in Manchester. And so their argument for communism or socialism, whether you agree with that or not, emerged out of these horrible working conditions we see in Barrett Browning's poem. And so even if you don't agree with socialism, um, we can kind of see how the horrible effects of capitalism led to it. Um, Capitalism can be a wonderful thing, but like anything in this world, the power, the potential of it can be abused. And in the industrial parts of Victorian England, like we see in Barrett Browning's poem, it really was abused badly. And so that's why you now get a response like communism slash socialism. And so um, the text I asked you to read along with this introduction to industrialism was what we call the first report on child labor. So people found out about child labor, wanted to do something about it, and so these different studies into it were conducted, and we have the first report. And like I mentioned in the last section on Tennyson, you have to do a cultural context section for your first paper. And this is a great example of kind of a mundane document. It's not a great novel, but it's so important to revealing the working conditions for child labor. And so this document inspired all kinds of reactions when it was published, including Barrett Browning's poem, which she wrote the same year, 1843. This document came out. And and so connecting her poem to a report like this would be a great example of the kind of cultural context work you can potentially do in your paper, as just as an example. But we'll talk more about that, and we'll look at examples of that in the next lesson. And if you read this report, all you really need to know is how deplorable the conditions were. Reading it to prepare this lesson, I was just taken aback at how awful they were. But Barrett Browning read it as well and reacted. And so um, we really see here how she's fighting for a social cause and how that was part of her poetry. And this, The Cry of the Children, is probably her most famous poem. One of her strategies in it is to try to sway the reader to empathize with the children. So trying to put the reader in the position of the children. So much of what happened with child labor is people didn't believe it was real, didn't believe it existed. They didn't immediately feel the effects of it, kind of like with slavery, where we talked about in lesson one, people used these colonial goods but didn't realize they were coming from the work of slaves. Similarly, here, people didn't realize how much they benefited from child labor that it existed. That's why that report we just talked about was so important, and that's why people like Barrett Browning reacted. So when she says, "Do ye hear? Do ye hear the children weeping, O my brothers? Ere their sorrow comes with years, they are leaning their young heads against their mothers, and even that cannot stop their tears." So she's trying to make you feel what the children feel, put you in their shoes. And I think that's an effective strategy to awakening people to this crisis. A passage I think is really important is the story of Alice in stanza 4, who's the child laborer who has died. And basically, the children are speaking here. So you have this interesting use of dialogue. And basically, what they say is that it's better for us. It is good when it happens, say the children, that we die before our time. So, again, to drive home the tragedy in this poem, to connect with the reader and get them to feel what the children are feeling, the idea that dying would be better than performing this labor. And they actually pray for this. And their praying brings me to my last bullet point and a question I'd like to ask you to see what you think. I haven't answered this. This might be a thesis or a thread you could do in your post, but um, I see really this poem building on Blake's The Chimney Sweeper, which we read earlier in the course. And there he gives that divine vision, which, depending on how you read it, is either a Christian or anti-Christian view in response to child labor. Barrett Browning was much more clearly a Christian than William Blake, who, was really argued against Christianity more overtly in some of his other poems. But here you have the children praying, and so this is also like the Chimney Sweeper, a spiritual poem. And so my question is, in what ways does Barrett Browning carry on the tradition of um, fighting against child labor through her poetry? And when we engage with these spiritual elements, how are they similar or different from what Blake does? Uh, Comparing and contrasting these two poems, I think, would make a really interesting study. All right, so we're going to move on to the runaway slave at Pilgrim's Point. I should have probably put some kind of disclaimer on the syllabus about the content of this poem, which is very difficult to handle. But I think it's important truth about what really happened in this country. And I think Barrett Browning does a brilliant job of engaging with the issue of slavery. And I think her approach to it is helpful. But this poem can be quite difficult to read. So I'm going to do my best to help us interpret it here. But please be prepared for some of the graphic content. And if you need to stop this part of the lesson and not watch the rest, I completely understand. The first line she says, I stand on the mark beside the shore of the first pilgrim's bended knee, where exile turned to ancestor and God was thanked for liberty. I have run through the night, my skin is as dark. I bend my knee down on this mark. I look on the sky and the sea. So again, this is a dramatic monologue, which we'll talk about more in the next lecture, like Tennyson's Ulysses. And here she's taken on the persona of a slave in the U.S. who's escaped. And what's interesting is this slave goes to Pilgrim's Point, which you probably know as Plymouth Rock, where the Pilgrims landed. And so the Pilgrims were fleeing England, ironically, for religious freedom. So this sacred ground, you could say, represents freedom. But by bending her knee where the pilgrims once did, the speaker is expressing her right to freedom. She's in a way trying to enter in to the pilgrims community, you could say. And so she's saying, even though I'm a black woman, even though I'm a slave, I am entitled to freedom too. And so it's a bold opening scene. As the scene continues, she says, O pilgrim souls, I speak to you. I see you come out proud and slow. From the land of the spirits, pale as dew, and round me ye go. O pilgrims, I have gasped and run all night long from the rips of one who in your names work sin and woe. So you have almost a supernatural element here where she's evoking the spirits of the long dead pilgrims, and it sounds like they appear and they gather around her. So continuing on my first point, she's really entering into this community of pilgrims, and that that community is all about freedom. And the first stanza in God was thanked for liberty at this very spot. And so that's so important that she has this right to freedom and she's naming and claiming her right to freedom here. But she also levels a critique at the slave owners. Um, she says that, they're descended from these pilgrims, but these pilgrims celebrated and thanked God for liberty. And by having slaves and abusing them, these slave owners have tarnished the names they have of their ancestors. They've rejected the values of the pilgrims, even though they share their names. So this is a harsh but well-earned critique she's leveling at the slave owners, and she's continuing to do it through this connection to the pilgrims. So the setting of Pilgrim's Point, to go back to the title of the poem, is incredibly important for what it represents. Continuing on, she says, and thus I thought that I would come and kneel here where I knelt before, and feel your souls around me hum, in undertone to the ocean's roar, and lift my black face, my black hand, here in your names to curse this land, ye blessed in freedoms evermore. So the curse here is really important. This land where the pilgrims thank God for liberty, she now curses. And a curse will come up again several times in the poem. So we need to keep that in mind. She also, for the first time, evokes her own blackness. She says, and lift my black face right before the curse. And that's important. We'll look as we go on, because the very next line says, I am black, and yet God made me, they say. But if he did so smiling back, he must have cast his work away under the feet of his white creatures with a look of scorn that the dusky features might be trodden to clay. So this phrase, I am black, she repeats throughout the poem. And what you have here is really unique. It's a direct discussion of blackness. And so Elizabeth Barrett Browning even expressed at the time that she was surprised the Liberty Bell, an American newspaper, published her poem because of its content. But she's not holding back here. That's one of the things I love about. They call her EBB, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, is that she just gets right in there and doesn't hold back, and points out and critiques the ugly truths of the world. So here we have kind of a crisis in faith moment over the next few lines, where the speaker's wondering if the black race, as the slaves, have been forsaken by God, because How could God let this happen to them is the question. But she goes on to debate that. She says in the next stanza, and yet he has made dark things to be glad and merry as light. There's a little dark bird sits and sings. There's a dark stream ripples out of sight. And the dark frogs chant in the safe morass, and the sweetest stars are made to pass o'er the face of the darkest night. And so she's throughout the poem there's use of imagery of light and dark. And so here she's talking about animals who are dark in coloring and they seem happy. God has blessed them. So as she struggles through, I guess the question she's asking is, has God forsaken me? And so as she's struggling through that, here she reaches a more optimistic point, you could say, than in the previous stanza. But in the next stanza, we see her compare herself to these animals, and it becomes a more pessimistic view again. But we who are dark, we are dark. God, we have no stars, to compare to that line about the stars in the last stanza. About our souls in care and cark, our blackness shuts like prison bars. The poor souls crouch so far behind that never a comfort can they find by reaching through the prison bars. And so here I think we don't see an entire regression to doubting God, but she's saying these other creatures that seem happy and blessed that are dark colored, the key difference between them and me is they are free. And so freedom is the essential point here she's making. And so I don't know if she's going quite as far as she did two stanzas back to say, God, you've forsaken me, but she's asking God why the slaves have been denied freedom here. And so these are the first six stanzas. This is a long poem. I wish we could go through all of it. It's such a brilliant, intense, important poem. If we were meeting in the classroom, we would. But I need to jump ahead to some of the most important passages from later on to not keep you too long in the selection. So I'm going to look now at the part where she kills her child, which is probably the most difficult part of it for you to read. And it's part of a literary tradition where slavery, when you think about it, was so bad that people actually killed their own children to keep them from being subjected to what they had been subjected to. And Toni Morrison's novel Beloved deals with this as well. But here we have 145 years earlier, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, EBB, addressing it in what I think is a very interesting, unique way, where the speaker says, I pulled the kerchief very close. He could not see the sun, I swear, more than alive than now he does, from between the roots of the mango, where, I know where, close a child and mother do wrong to look at one another, when one is black and one is fair. And so some of the earlier stanzas that I skipped describe how she was raped by the slave owners. And so the child is the product of miscegenation, which just means a word that means the um, mixing of the races in childbirth. And so ultimately, the child is a reminder to her of the abuse at the hands of the slave owners. And there's a distance, a disconnect. Mother and child are not close the way they should be. They do wrong to look at one another when one is black and one is fair or white. And so this distance between her and her child is really important throughout the entire poem. We'll continue to look at and see how she works through it. In the next stanza, she says, why in that single glance I had of my child's face, I tell you all, I saw a look that made me mad. The master's look that used to fall on my soul like his lash or worse. And so to save it from my curse, I twisted it round in my shawl. And so this gap continues to grow between mother and child because the child actually looks like the slave owner who raped her. And um, but she says to save it from my curse, I twisted it round in my shawl. And so I don't think it's the distance here or even the reminder of the abuse that causes her to kill her own child. I think it's really actually um, that she's trying to protect the child from her curse, from experiencing what she's experienced. We're going to, for the sake of time, skip ahead to the last two stanzas here. She's at the end of the poem. She's eventually captured by the slave owners and bounty hunters who are hunting her since she's run away. And when she dies, she compares herself to Jesus Christ, who, as you know, also died. She says, "Our wounds are different. Your white men are, after all, not gods indeed, nor able to make Christ again. Do good with bleeding. We who bleed, stand off, we help not in our loss. We are too heavy for a cross, and fall and crush you in your seed." So here she's addressing the white men directly. As she dies, she makes a comparison between herself and Christ. But if you know the gospel from the Bible, you know that God asked Jesus to make this sacrifice, and many Christians believe God is sovereign, so he oversaw Christ's death. And so she's basically saying, this is like what happened to Christ. This is an execution of a good person who doesn't deserve to die like Christ. But even though the slave owners are the ones saying she needs to be killed and overseeing it, they are not like God. And to go back to that first stanza, by doing this, they dishonor their Christian names. In the last line, she actually evokes a curse from Genesis 3, which is after Adam and Eve have sinned by eating the apple. And God is cursing them, and the serpent, he curses the serpent, and he says, the woman's, you are made to go on the ground, serpent, and the woman's offspring will crush your head, which the serpent represents the devil, and the woman's offspring is eventually Jesus, and Jesus defeats death when he's crucified and rises again. And so here you have a really similar curse to what God says in Genesis 3 when he tells the serpent, you will walk on the ground and the woman's offspring will crush your head. Here, she says, and fall and crush you in your seed. And so the slavers then are the ultimate evil. They're like the devil. And this is perhaps an optimistic note. She could be suggesting here that one day the slaves will maybe even rise up, but that they'll crush their masters. All right, final stanza. I fall, I swoon, I look at the sky. The clouds are breaking on my brain. I am floated along as if I should die of liberty's exquisite pain. In the name of the white child waiting for me, and the death dark where we may kiss and agree, white men, I leave you all curse free in my broken heart's disdain. So, in the final stanza, she returns to the two biggest themes of the poem. One being the gap, the distance between the speaker and the child. And so this is, I think, really actually an optimistic ending, despite everything we've read so far, because she says they'll be reunited here when she dies, just as the child has died. And so again, you have the blending of colors, and the death dark. And so she is dark, the child is white, but death is dark, and they both will have died at this point, so they'll be reunited in that way. But I think we should assume that they go to heaven. Most of the evidence in the poem indicates that. And so heaven is usually this white imagery. So there's this merging here. So they're reconnected in death. They're reconnected in heaven. And along with that, what's really interesting is she chooses not to curse the white men. She says, white men, I leave you all curse free. At the beginning of the poem, she cursed the land. Where the pilgrims bent their knees and thanked God for liberty. And so this ending is very controversial. Scholars, since they started writing on this poem, have interpreted it different ways. One way is a negative kind of critique of it, which is an example of Christian passivity. She's choosing not to act here, to be passive, to not punish them. Even though she could, since the poem was started with the scenario of her claiming her right to freedom and cursing the land, she could curse them. And so some critics read it as Christian passivity and say, no, Elizabeth Barrett Browning should have her character here take a more active stance. But if you read it another way, you could see another way to interpret it. You could look at this really important line where she says, "In the name of the white child waiting for me." So as she's making this proclamation as she dies, she's invoking the name of the white child. And we talked about the female speaker here, but it might be as a Christ figure, but it might be even more logical to interpret the child she's killed as a Christ figure, um, because um, there are some similarities here with how the child is born and then dies is very similar to Christ if you look at the Christ story. And so what Christ's death represents is forgiveness and redemption. And so maybe it's not Christian passivity here, but maybe it's creating an avenue for something better, an optimistic eternal future, which in that sense makes it very similar to the ending to In Memoriam. So it's a challenging poem to interpret. I can't wait to read your interpretations. Um, I hope it really shows how Elizabeth Barrett Browning engaged with the social issues of the day and as a female poet cast this unique perspective and helped fight for these important causes. The last poem by her that I assigned is called Mother and Poet, and it's actually my favorite poem by her, but it's not as famous as these two, so that's why I wanted to provide the close reading on these two. But you still can and should write on Mother and Poet, and I'd love to hear your interpretations of it. But what it really is a dramatic monologue of her taking on the persona of an Italian woman who lost both of her sons in the war for independence that was fought in Italy in the 19th century, but she was also a poet. And so she takes on the voice of this real historical woman who, very much like herself, was a poet and had a close relationship with her sons. And EBB was very close to her son because she only had one child, and she was only able to have a child because Robert helped her escape her father and get healthy. And so her poetry and her being a mother were very important to her. And she takes on this voice of this historical figure who also really values those things. So it's a beautiful poem, and I hope you do read it and enjoy it.